Dear learners, welcome back to SWAYAM NPTEL course on library automation and networking. This is week 5, module number 5, computerized information services, lecture number 23. The title of this particular lecture is reference service and information service. Dear learners, we have learnt much about the services which are available in a particular library. You take any library, whether it is a small library or a bigger library like university library system, school library, special library, public library, or libraries of national importance. So you take any as example. So there can be minimum services which are available in a particular library to provide maximum services to the users. As we know that why we are providing such kind of a services, because users have their own demands and they are working on different areas, they have their own interest areas. So ultimately we have to provide them the collection in which you are having, as well as apart from that there are some additional services that also required for them to support their learning or teaching or research purpose. So when you look at that angle, normally you take any library, when you are working in any library, so we have to provide some kind of an additional service in addition to the service which are part of our normal activities. Say for example, you take circulation, we have many circulation activities which are also part of a service in which you do issue, return, transactions, reservation, reminders, collecting the fines. All these activities are part of circulation division. But when you are providing circulation services, if a particular person come and ask you how many books I have taken in a particular month or how many books are pending with my account, so you should be able to provide such kind of answers so that the users will be happy. And in the similar way, they can come with other questions also. It can be a research question, or it can be something which is related to the library activities, library services. Sometimes it can be recommendations, suggestions, feedbacks. Anything can be given by a particular user to a particular library. Sometimes it is something like a responsive answers, like somebody is asking something to you and you are giving answers to that. And sometimes you feel that maybe people will ask this, so you can provide such kind of a services in the later stage or in the same time. Now there are situations in which you feel that people may ask or the users may ask some questions in the future, so let it be ready now so that if someone is required that they can utilize that. So there are services which we provide in terms of response, or we can say that in terms of demand. Somebody is asking or somebody is demanding, somebody is requiring that service, that we can call it as a demand service. And whereas sometimes we provide the service in anticipation, feeling that maybe this particular user may ask in this future, this particular service is required. So something like that, we have many services in a library: alerting services, responsive services, service on demand, service in anticipation. So these are all different types of services normally we could see in a particular library, whether it is small or bigger libraries. But only the difference is the nature of library sometimes make the changes in that. So in this particular session, we will be learning more about one of the major services in any of the library. Normally in higher education systems or special libraries, we can see that reference services and information services. So in this particular session, we will be learning more about reference services, information services. What do you mean by these two services? Is there any difference between these two services? And how do we provide such kind of a services? And what are the characteristics of reference service as well as information services? What are the different types of information services? As a whole, we will be discussing more about reference service as well as information service. So dear learners, so when we talk about reference service, as we know that the name indicates, it is something like a reference. That means you are giving something like a reference for a particular person in which who is asking something to you. So you take any library, as we have discussed. Libraries have to provide lot of services, wide range of services for the users in which they are coming for a particular information. So that kind of service we normally called it as reference services. That kind of services broadly known as reference and information services. So that means somebody is asking you as a librarian or a reference librarian or a person who is in a particular library, it can be for an information. so that you will be able to provide such kind of an information either at the same time or maybe in the later stage. So anyway they are asking for something to get from you, so that feedback you have to provide to them. That is normally in terms of an information that we call it as reference service or information service. We can't make a single definition or a standard definition saying that this is the reference service. Why? Because this service can be different from different types of libraries. Say for example, if you take a university library system, the service provided as a reference or information services can be entirely different from a school library, how they are providing such kind of a reference service or information services. So it can be differ from the nature or the type of libraries or the categories of libraries, subjects in which you are dealing with that particular library, say for example research library or a special library, and also sometimes the strength of the staff as well as users, intellectual level of the users in which it can differ, and sometimes it also can differ based on your collection and the type of services and resources you are providing. So each and every time there can be a variety of reference services as well as information services based on the nature or category or the types of libraries and the strength of manpower or the staff in which you are having and the number of services you are providing, the limitations in terms of finance, machines, infrastructure as well as in terms of collection. So all these scenarios, there can be a difference in the services provided to a particular user, but ultimately the user comes to you for getting some kind of an information because he is seeking an information from you to find out or to get a particular answer for that particular query. So normally this kind of questions and answers where the librarian and the user is going to interact together, we call it as reference service or information services. And again, depends on the nature of services you are providing. Say for example, when you talk about reference service, as I told you that the person who comes and asks you some question, you need to answer for that. But what will happen if you don't know the answer? So there are some cases which differ again from the question. Suppose if the person come and ask you a simple questions like what could be the fine amount if I am delayed or if my due date is 1 day before. So how much amount I have to pay for 1 day. So that means you are clear that how much amount you are going to levy from a particular user based on their categories. So that means it is a simple question you will be able to answer without any kind of other references or without any kind of much more time. There is no delay in getting the answer for the users. That is something like a short-term reference service. That means you are giving in a minimum period. It can be less than 1 minute or less than 5 minutes in which you are providing such kind of a services. But sometimes the user's query can be very complex because he is working in a particular research project and he wanted to get all the resources in that particular area, and he is asking you what is the implication of artificial intelligence technology in the modern libraries, especially in this particular geographical area. So how do you provide such kind of information? So that is a kind of a complex query you are getting from a user. For that, either you should be an expert or you should know something about that. Even if you know also, you should be able to update yourself. So for providing such kind of an information as an answer for such kind of a query, it may take more time. So that kind of service is also part of reference service. So whether it is asking for a reference service or information service, in both the cases, time factor is important. Sometimes there will be ready reference services and sometimes it may take time, so that the user have to wait as well as the staff has to practice for that. And again, when we talk about reference service, as we are providing something to the user, and this service also can be differ in terms of the number of users in which this particular query is asking. So that particular query can be asked by a single user or it can be asked by a group of people. So in both the cases, you may get a query in such a way that it is answering only for a one person, and sometimes the answer will be for a group of people. So there can be a difference in the answer or difference in providing the answers to a user as well as a group of users. So reference service can be different in that way also. And when we talk about reference service, as I told you that this is one of the areas in which we provide services to the users, and apart from that there are many regular services. So these services sometimes we will not be able to see in all the libraries, as we know that there are some basic and essential services in the library. Say for example, you take any library, or it is a small library or a bigger library, normally if it is a service oriented library, normally they will be having a minimum circulation counter. That means they are providing circulation services to the users. In that way it is a mandatory, or we can say that it's a basic or essential service you are providing to the users. So similarly, if you look at the other libraries, like little bigger libraries, say for example a special library or a research library, definitely they will be having circulation services, as well as they will be having some additional services like interlibrary loan services and circulation services, maintenance services, and sometimes reference services, referral services, document delivery services, translation services. So these are all different types of services, but ultimately irrespective of the type of library or the nature of collection in which you are having, all the libraries will have some kind of a common or basic functionalities or services which are related to circulation, periodical, interlibrary loan, or even the reference and referral services. But there are some cases where we provide some kind of an additional services. It can be a personalized services in which a particular person is coming and asking you, or it can be a service which is very much fine tuned, so that that particular group of people are getting, they are asking the questions and you are giving the answers for that. So such kind of services, apart from the normal services, the services in which you are providing as a personalized services, or a services in which has a demand, we call it as reference service, or the services which are either in demand or in anticipation, that kind of services for information, that we call it as information services. There are synonyms for reference service. Reference service also called as reference and information services or reader services. That means the reader is playing an important role in this particular reference and information services. So we can say that it is a kind of a personalized service, or a particular individual or a group of individuals are asking for a particular information, or they are seeking some kind of an information from you, that is part of reference service. So here what is happening is, you can see that the question is asked by a user. As a librarian or as a reference librarian, you are supposed to answer for that particular query. That means there could be a question and answer. So for that, for answering that particular question, you should have a proper knowledge, as well as you should be able to get a proper idea about what this particular user is asking. So because users may have something in his or her mind, so that has to be properly communicated to you, then only you will be able to provide a better service. So what is happening here in between you as a librarian or a reference librarian as well as the user is, there is a close personalized service, or we can say that there is a personal interaction or high degree of interaction between the user as well as the reference librarian. So in such cases, as a user, we have to give some kind of an instruction to the user. They can come with different types of queries. It can be simple, it can be complex, or it can be subject related, or it can be general. So anything can be part of that. So what kind of instruction as a reference librarian you have to provide to the users? When you talk about reference service, that means the person who is acting as a reference librarian, they have to instruct the users in such a way that they may come for using some kind of a resource which they could not find out. So definitely they will come to the reference librarian and they will ask the questions to you. So you should be able to provide them proper tool or suitable tool in which he is or she is looking for a particular information based on the query. And sometimes you have to tell them the method of finding the information. How do we find out that particular information? Because he or she is not able to find the information or the book in the shelf. So they are coming and asking to you. So that means you should be able to provide such kind of an information, and what is the way to find such kind of an information or a document. And sometimes you have to instruct the users in terms of online searches, because many of the people, they know that information is available in the internet, but how do we search? How do we use the search strategies? How do we use the search techniques? Or how can we retrieve such kind of an information in a relevant manner? And what is the search terms or keywords that has to be combined, that has to be used along with a logical strategy? So these all have to be instructed to the user by a particular reference librarian. And sometimes if a person is not able to locate a particular source of information, either it can be in online format or it can be in print format. Even such kind also, the location of a particular document or the resources which are available online has to be provided to the users by the reference librarian. And apart from that, when you look at the reference librarian's role in the case of research libraries, so there may be many kind of analysis type of questions in which a particular person as a reference librarian has to perform such kind of an analysis. Say for example, as the librarian or a reference librarian, they will be dealing with the databases. So when you look at the databases, it is a collection of electronic resources in a systematic manner in which you can have searches and get the bibliographical details, citation analysis, indexing, abstracting, etc. So if somebody asks a question that what are the publications available in this particular area of study, he may say that artificial intelligence. That means the questions will be asked by the user that I am looking for artificial intelligence application in library and information science. So could you please find out all the information which are published on this particular subject area in a particular time period, say for example last 5 years. And you need to analyze such kind of a query in which what are the countries produce such kind of information, and during this particular period how many resources have been published, and how many are journal articles, how many are book chapters, how many are e-books, etc. So these have to be found out by a particular librarian, and he has to analyze that. So sometimes the query can come in that way also, where people are asking for analysis. And apart from that, as a reference librarian, you need to educate them what are the resources available, how do we access that, and what are the resources in which you will be able to get your own particular area. That means a kind of information literacy have to be provided to the users as a role of reference librarian. And all these are all you can do as a reference librarian, but there are some kind of a limitation for the reference librarian also. Suppose sometimes the reference librarian will not be a subject expert. In that case, he can receive the query. He can't say that, no, I won't receive because I don't know about this particular area. But you should be able to receive such kind of a questions, and you should have a provision for getting some kind of an expert in this particular area. Normally you can see Ask a Librarian. So it is a kind of a web-based information services where people can ask some queries. It can be a complex query through email, or as well as even the direct, or maybe they can use a web-based platform to make a query on that particular subject area. In such cases, you need to find out the basics of that particular question, and you find out the expert in that particular area, transfer the queries to the expert and ask the expert to speak to the users, or maybe the expert can give a feedback to you so that you can transfer to the concerned user. So these are all possible, and all these services we collectively call it as reference service or information services. And ultimately what we have seen is, though users are irrespective of their area of study, they will be able to provide any kind of a questions to you. As a reference librarian, or we can call them as a specialist, they should be having some skill. So it is not that you should be expert in knowing all the subject, but at least you should be able to know what are the sources of information in which you will be able to provide. If somebody is asking a simple question that who is the 10th president of India, so that is a simple question, but sometimes you may be not getting the direct answer for such kind of a questions. So there are sources you should know, whether you should refer some kind of a newspapers or online resources or encyclopedias or maybe yearbooks. So these are all the different types of sources in which you can get some kind of a primary information. So at least as a person who is acting as a reference librarian should have some kind of a skill to find out where this particular information can be getting. So that means that at least the location or the source of information can be given to the users, even if you are not able to provide the complete answer for the query. So ultimately the person as acting as a specialist or a reference librarian should have a general knowledge about almost all the areas in which that particular library is dealing with, as well as the nature of or the characteristics of users also. So when we talk about reference services and information services, these two services are interconnected. We can say that these are all interconnected, but they are complementary to library and information services. So sometimes when we talk about these two distinct characters like reference services and information services, sometimes the meaning will be same for a particular library, but depends on the nature of library or categories of library or the categories in which or the type in which that particular library is providing the services. So based on that, the definitions can change, or the characteristics of reference service as well as information services can be changed. So when you look at the reference services, so we should know what are the different modes or ways of providing reference services, and also the functions of reference services. What are the different types of reference queries? What are the different types in which a particular user is required? That means the user is coming for a particular information. So based on that information, what are the different categories of information for a reference service? And also, what are the other names which we call it for reference services? So these are all the major areas in which we will look into detail. And the first one is the ways, that means the mode of operations in which you are providing a particular reference service to a particular user. So there are different ways or different modes to provide reference services. The first one is face-to-face reference services. As the name indicates, it is something like you are physically interacting with the users. That means it is a kind of interaction between you and the user in a real time, in a physical mode. It is not online mode, it is face-to-face in a physical mode. But even in the computer terminology also, sometimes in the virtual nature we can say that suppose we are going for an online conversation, it can also be a face-to-face conversation. So but face-to-face reference services, normally the person physically visit the library and ask for a question, and you will be able to answer for such kind of a questions. So that is one of the major ways in which we can provide a reference services to the users, that is face-to-face reference service. Second one is reference service through mobile phones or mobile technologies. As we know that the technologies are highly advanced, now people are using mobile phones and such kind of a social medias where we can transfer the information from one person to another person without any kind of disturbance. So in this particular case, we will be able to provide such kind of a services in a online format, that means mobile technologies. And there are some kind of a real-time conversation in an online mode, that we call it as virtual reference services, where you are interacting with a particular user not in the physical but in an online format in the real time. That means he is asking the question online and you are able to answer for the same thing in the online format at the instant time. Video conference, voice over IP, co-browsing, IM or instant messaging, these are some of the examples for such kind of virtual reference services. The other one is online reference service. As we know that if you send an email, so the person will receive, that means there is no real-time interaction. So whenever that person come into whenever that particular person looking into this particular email, then only he will come to know that there is a query has come. So even in the similar way, the answer can be provided to the user and he may be checking at another time. So there is no real-time interaction between the user as well as the reference librarian. Such services are normally happens in the online reference service mode. Email, website, SMS, Ask a Librarian, these are all part of that. And of course, social networking platforms like wikis, blogs, or any kind of medias, we use it as social networking sites. So these are also can be used for providing the reference services to the users, which are normally in online format. And according to American Library Association, there are 6 functions for reference services. What are those functions listed here as? Supervision function, information function, guidance function, instruction function, bibliographic function, and appraisal function. These are all 6 categories made by the American Library Association when you are providing a reference services. That means when you are providing information, that we call it as information service or reference service and information services. And when you are providing some kind of an instruction to use this particular terminology, you use this particular tool to provide this particular answer. So that kind of guidance you can give, appraisal you can give, instruction can be given. So based on that, these 6 categories are made. And when you talk about reference queries, there are different types of queries can be given to a particular librarian. It can be a directional query, that means the query requires some kind of a direction to the user. Procedural queries, that means that particular query has to have some kind of a procedures, that means this is the procedures to get a particular book. Say for example, you are asking how do I get a membership card. So he can say that this is the procedure in which you need to follow for getting your membership in the library. So that we call it as procedural queries. simple and basic reference queries. As I told you that who is the 10th Prime Minister of India? It is a simple query in which you have to answer for that. There are some kind of a research queries. It will be normally complex queries, and what kind of analysis I have to done for getting this particular answer, or how do I find out this particular area, or how do I find out this particular type of information which is located in a particular geographical area. So anything can be a research question. So that can normally be a complex query. And apart from that, there can be bibliographical queries in which a bibliographic analysis is required. What are the subject in which the user is asking a particular query, that what are the resources available in this particular subject area. So you have to make a bibliographical analysis. So that we call it as bibliographical queries. And type of information, normally it can be research oriented. It can be a type of problem solving. And sometimes it is for gaining some kind of an insight in a specific subject area, in which a particular person is working in one area. When you do his project or research, he could find out that, okay, this particular area also interested to me, but I don't know anything about this particular area. So he got some kind of an interest on that area, so that he will come and ask the reference librarian, I am interested in this particular area, could you please tell something more about this specific subject area. That is also a kind of type of information required by a user. And this reference division, sometimes we call it as reference division, reference desk, or research assistant centers. So these are all the different terminology we use for reference service area, or a particular desk or division in which handling reference queries. So according to Ranganathan, when we talk about reference services, Ranganathan says that reference service is, it is a personal service provided to each and every user, helping them to find out a particular document, answering his interest in a particular area. That should be exhaustively, pinpointedly, and that should be timely. That means you have to provide the right information to the right user at the right time for the right purpose. So when you look at the reference services, we can categorize them into two divisions. One is ready reference service, the other one is long range reference services. So there is though these two reference services are similar, but there is a slight difference in the functioning of reference services. In a short term, we can call that, in a short term, if we are answering the query of a reference question, that can be called it as short range reference services or ready reference services. It may take less than 5 minutes. And normally such kind of a queries will be general in nature, simple, it won't be complex, you can answer in a ready-made format. And it is something like a fact-finding questions, so that it consumes very less timing. And you can use all such kind of a ready reference sources like encyclopedias, yearbooks, almanac, annual reports. See, these things can be easily find out from such kind of a information sources. And such kind of a queries can be easily to provide face to face, over phone, or over mobile as a short SMS, instant message, etc., because the answer is very short. So you will be able to provide in no seconds. And normally simple question, simple answer. So when you look at the long range reference services, as the name indicates, it may take more time. So why it is taking more time? Because this query is very much complex in nature. So it cannot be a general query, it can be a specific query. So somebody like subject specialist can ask such kind of a queries. So you may take more than 5 minutes, 5 to 30 minutes can be taken, or it can take more than that, or maybe one day you can take. So such kind of information will be very specific. You need to work more on that particular area, so that the document in which you are going to refer also will be in a wider sense. That means you have to refer many of the resources in a different formats, in different categories to get an answer for this particular query. So normally such kind of a queries can be a research oriented query also. Complex question, complex answer. So these are the two major categories of reference services. So apart from this, when you wanted to evaluate a reference service, what are the criteria which are involved in evaluating a particular reference services? So these are all the major things I have listed here. These are all very much important to evaluate based on the nature of query and the answer in which you are providing. So reference services have to follow some kind of evaluation strategy to measure whether that particular reference service has been properly fulfilled or properly answered or satisfied by the users or not. So what are the criteria normally we use to measure or evaluate the reference service effectiveness is accuracy of the answer in which you are providing, the time in which you have taken for providing the answer and the user's satisfaction after getting the query, after getting the answer for the query in which the user asked, how far he is satisfied with the answer. And based upon the follow-ups, suppose sometimes the query may take more than 1 day, 2 days, we need to make a follow-up. That means it has to go for a long range. In that, follow-up cases also will be part of an evaluative measure. Usefulness of the answer in which you have given, and what was the efficiency of the answer, assurance which you have given for that particular answer, rate of repeated user. Suppose if a person coming repeatedly, either he may come with the same query, that means he is not satisfied. If he comes with a different query, that means he is very much interested in your reference services. So based on that also the evaluation can be done. And how much amount you are spending for providing such kind of a services. As I told you that sometimes the reference will not be available in your library, and sometimes you need to consult the expert who is not there in your library or in your organization. So in such kind of things there will be a involvement of finance or funding. So how much cost you have incurred for providing such kind of an answer. So that is also be an evaluation criteria. The completion time in which you have taken, and the technology in which you have used, and how much technological involvement is available, access, equity, response time, how much time you have taken. So these are all the major evaluation criteria. And apart from that, the effectiveness of meeting the records, anticipatory needs. So once you talk about the reference requirements, that means the user comes and asks you something, you are querying, you are getting a query and you are answering for that. But how far it is effective for that particular person, and from that experience, if you are able to provide some kind of other services, that means as I discussed that we have two categories of services, like one is for the demand, the other for is in anticipation. So there are some experience which you gain from the answering of queries. You may be knowing that there are some queries it may come in the future. So such kind of answers need to be provided earlier, that we call it as service in anticipation. So that also should be part of reference services. So that is also one of the criteria for evaluation. And all such categories like approachability, reliability, empathy, interest, listening, how far you are listening to the user to get a query, how complex it is, and how we are able to provide the answer in the way in which they are asking or they are expecting the answer. Service quality, tangibility, all these are part of evaluation criteria. There are many more criteria where we can use, but all it depends on the categories of services you are providing or the complex nature of query in which a particular user is asking. Dear learners, with this I hope that you could get a clear idea about reference service. So you may be having some kind of a doubt in your mind. So what is the difference between reference service as well as information service? Though sometimes it simultaneously use and interchangeably use it. So more or less these two concepts are distinct, but these are all complementary each other. So in such cases, as I told you that reference service is something you are expecting, or it is a kind of a personalized service, whereas information service you are already made for the users in anticipation. That means you are providing some kind of a catalog service like online public access catalog or reference services which are very much required for a particular group of users. So these are all already made. So such kind of a sources in which a particular person is coming for an information which is already been ready. So that we call it as information services. The way in which you are providing the services is more or less similar, but the provision of acting on that particular query in which one is already ready, the other one is you are having a personalized assistance. So this is the difference between reference and information services. So in short, we can differ these two services in terms of different categories. The one is high level of interaction. That means in a reference service we need a level of interaction more. The degree of level of interaction will be more in the case of reference service as you are providing a personalized services. That is very much concise to that particular person. Whereas the query will be general in nature in information service, so that the interaction will be minimum. The scope of the service will be narrower in the case of reference service as you are receiving the specific queries. Whereas it is general in the case of a information service. And in-depth guidance is required in the reference side, whereas general guidance is okay in the information services. Users sometimes go for such kind of a services as a self in case of reference service, whereas they depend completely on a particular person or a staff in the case of information services. Direct personal assistance will be there in the reference service, whereas in the information services there is no direct assistance is required. one is passive, the other one is active. Reference is always passive. Why? Because they are asking something, then you are become active. That means you are still passive. When you get a query, you are giving an answer for that. That means it is a passive service in which you are providing to the user. Whereas you are already been active, you made that service ready for the users. That is why always information service is an active service. And when you look at the traditional way, reference service is part of a traditional services, whereas information, which is dealing with information as well as the assistance of technology, so we can say that it is a kind of a contemporary services or non-traditional services. So in that way, we can call them as a responsive reference services as well as anticipatory information services. So there are different types of advantages. Now when we look at that angle of point of view of advantages and disadvantages, each services has its own advantages and disadvantages. If the user is satisfied with this queries, he will be getting the advantage of such kind of a reference service. So that means he will be satisfied. You are getting an advantage of providing such kind of a services to the users. And sometimes there will be delay, then users may be not required such kind of an information after some time. That means the currency of that particular information is very much important. So that is the reason why Ranganathan says in his definition, saying that right information to the right user at the right time, that too a personalized service, we call it as reference services. So dear learners, let me conclude with this statement. As we know that there are many libraries of different categories, different types, and they are different in their services and activities. So reference services, normally it is a kind of a personalized services. Every user looks for that, and whenever you are successful in providing the exhaustive and the correct information to the user in which the query is asked, you will be successful in that way. So reference service as well as information services, both are two sides of a same coin, but sometimes they are used in an interchangeable manner based on the services in which you are providing in a particular library. So when you consider a reference library or a special library, the reference services will be more intact rather than a general library like university library system. So always the librarian or the reference librarian or a specialist, he has his own responsibility in providing the reference services. You may take more time as a reference librarian or less time as a reference librarian based on the complexity of the query from the user, but ultimately you should be very much skilled in that particular area. You should know the sources of resources which are available, and somebody asks a ready reference question, you should be able to know where you will be able to get such kind of a answer for such kind of a simple queries. There you will be made as a good reference librarian. With this, I hope that you could understand what is the reference services, what is the difference between reference service and information services, what are the different types of reference services, what are the evaluation criteria in which we use to measure the effectiveness of a reference service, etc. So I hope you will be able to make such kind of a responsibility when you become a reference librarian. Thank you.